Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we unpack complex topics and really try to get to the heart of what matters. Today, we're embarking on, well, a pretty fascinating journey into something as old as humanity itself, predicting the future. And specifically, we're setting our sights on 2025. It's a year that, like many before, seems to have drawn quite a bit of attention from all sorts of people, mystics, prophets, scientists, too.
That's right. And our mission today really is to sift through this incredibly rich, sometimes contradictory tapestry of human foresight. We'll explore everything from, that ancient, almost primal urge to figure out destiny, to our modern reliance on hard data and complex models. The idea is to understand how these vastly different ways of looking at things view what lies ahead, especially when it comes to these big societal shifts, or, as often happens, these notions of the end of the world.
Yeah, and we've pulled together a really diverse stack of sources for this deep dive. I mean, they take us everywhere, from looking at religious prophecies and astrological forecasts, all the way over to detailed, data-heavy climate science reports, and even some deep philosophical thinking on uncertainty itself. It's a lot to cover.
It really is. It's a complex landscape for
Yeah.
sure. And we're here to help you navigate it, hopefully, to sort of distinguish what's truly important from maybe the noise.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's maybe kick things off with this enduring fascination humanity seems to have with the end of days. It really feels like every generation, doesn't it? Across different cultures, different beliefs, they all seem to have their own set of, well, dire predictions, their own timeline for some big cataclysm or maybe a spiritual shift. We've seen quite a list of these come and go, haven't we?
Oh, indeed.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If you just look back over the last century or so, our sources show this really consistent and frankly kind of humbling pattern, prediction after prediction that just didn't happen. And this isn't new, of course. It seems to be deeply baked into the human experience. It reflects this fundamental need, I think, to find meaning or maybe impose some order, perhaps even assign blame when facing big societal anxieties, uncertainties.
Right. People just seem driven to pinpoint that exact moment.
Exactly. Pinpoint the cataclysm, the divine intervention, whatever it is, driven by intense belief sometimes, or maybe a desire for control, or even just a yearning for some kind of massive transformation.
And when we say packed with specific dates and dramatic claims, we mean really specific. Like take 1901, way
Right.
back then, the Catholic Apostolic Church, this was a religious movement from the 1830s. They had this really clear prophecy. They claimed Jesus would return by the time their very last founding member died.
And he did pass away in 1901.
He did. The last member passed in 1901, but, well, here we are. Over a century later, the expectation was so incredibly precise, tied right to one person's life. Makes the failure pretty stark, doesn't it?
It does. Or think about Annie Keeler, a Connecticut doctor, also in 1901. She predicted the world would end because of a planetary alignment, a specific configuration she thought mirrored the days of Noah, thought it would trigger this massive flood.
So that highlights that recurring theme, right? Celestial events as signs, as harbingers.
Exactly. It's this deep-seated idea across so many narratives, cosmic events dictating doom. It kind of binds humanity's fate to the stars. This grand, mysterious cosmic dance. It speaks to our feeling small in the universe, maybe, and the idea that forces way beyond our control are at play, even when science doesn't back up the catastrophic interpretation.
Here's one where it gets really interesting, showing how even actual science can get twisted by anxiety. 1910. Camille Flammarion, who was a very respected French astronomer, he genuinely worried about Halley's Comet on its close pass. Not impact, but he thought it would snuff out all life by filling the atmosphere with toxic gas, cyanogen.
Cyanogen, why?
Yeah. And this fear, it was so widespread, so real, that, get this, people started selling comet pills in pharmacies, marketed as protection against these supposed toxic fumes.
Comet pills, it's something else. Shows how fear can be exploited.
Totally. And then you have figures like Charles Taze Russell, hugely influential in the Bible students movement, which later led to the Jehovah's Witnesses. He marked October 1914, very specific again, as the close of that battle of God Almighty. He saw it as this culmination of prophetic events that he believed had been unfolding since 1874. The sheer precision of these dates, combined with these vivid images, divine intervention, cosmic destruction, it really grips the imagination.
And we also see this pattern of, remarkable persistence, even when predictions fail. Look at Herbert W. Armstrong, founder of the Worldwide Church of God. He first prophesied the rapture for 1936. His followers would be taken to heaven, supposedly. When that didn't happen, he didn't give up. He revised it 3 more times.
3 times.
Yep. First in 1943, then 1972, and finally 1975. This sticking to it Even when reality clearly disagrees, it says a lot about the psychological investment people have in these beliefs. They often double down instead of, reevaluating.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And similarly, the Jehovah's Witnesses, who branched off from Russell's movement, they suggested Armageddon would wrap up by late 1975. They tied it to being exactly 6,000 years after man's creation, based on their reading of biblical chronology. Shows how specific interpretations of sacred texts can lead to these very concrete, though often wrong, expectations about the future.
And some of these stories are even more dramatic, tragically so. Dorothy Martin, remember her, the UFO cult leader? Her group got a lot of attention. She predicted the world would be totally destroyed by flooding, December 21st, 1954.
Right. And the aftermath of that failed prophecy.
Exactly. It was so significant, so interesting to social scientists, that it became the focus of that classic 1956 book, When Prophecy Fails. That book, written by psychologists, it actually documents the mental gymnastics people go through when deeply held beliefs crash into reality. It's kind of a perfect case study for our topic, isn't it?
It really is. And we can't forget the tragic stories, like the Branch Davidians.
Yeah.
Florence Houteff predicted the Book of Revelation apocalypse for April 26, 1959. When her prophecy failed, the group didn't just dissolve, it splintered. Different factions tried to reinterpret it, justify why it didn't happen, which actually solidified the core belief for some. Or Jim Jones, infamous founder of the People's Temple. He first envisioned a nuclear holocaust back in 1967 as the reason for his community to exist, to survive, a vision that just horribly ended up culminating in the Jonestown massacre. These examples, they tragically underscore the intense belief, the absolute loyalty, and sometimes the truly dire, fatal consequences tied to these prophecies. Shows in the starkest terms how conviction can just override reason and lead to devastation.
It's a truly remarkable pattern. You see it again and again through history, don't you? From that specific date, from the Catholic Apostolic Church in 1901 to the Jehovah's Witnesses calculations. Then you have astrologers like Jean Dixon predicting destruction from planets aligning in 62 that led to huge prayer meetings in India, all the way to someone like Charles Manson predicting an apocalyptic race war in 69, tapping into the racial tensions of the time.
The list just goes on and on.
It really does, often tied to specific dates, weird celestial stuff, or this deep feeling that society is morally decaying and needs some kind of intervention, divine or cosmic. It consistently shows this deep human drive, doesn't it? Seeking meaning, order, certainty in a world that's just inherently uncertain.
Which brings us sort of inevitably to now. So what about 2025? Are there similar mystical, astrological, or maybe faith-based predictions floating around right now? Are they getting much attention, echoing these old patterns?
Oh, absolutely. Our sources definitely confirm that within, various mystical and astrological circles, 2025 has been given this profound prophetic status, just like other significant years before it. One big focus, a really rare planetary alignment that happened back on February 28, 2025. It involved this incredible gathering, 7 major planets, Saturn, Mercury, Neptune, Venus, Uranus, Jupiter, and Mars, all lined up on one side of the sun.
7 planets. That's quite a lineup. Visually stunning, I imagine, if you could see it from space.
Totally, a cosmic ballet, right?
And what do these traditions say it means for us down here?
Well, many in these traditions interpret these rare configurations as, and I'm quoting here, powerful indicators of significant shifts, new beginnings, or the culmination of long cosmic cycles.
The sheer number of planets involved in this one, all on one side of the sun, is seen as this especially potent energetic signal, signifying profound, maybe even world-altering change.
A big energetic shift.
Kind of. And beyond that specific alignment, our sources point to other key planetary movements around this time, like Uranus entering Gemini, Saturn entering Aries. These transits are believed to usher in periods of, well, groundbreaking change, intense innovation, widespread societal upheaval, and maybe a fundamental reevaluation of established structures and existing power dynamics.
So less about a fiery end, maybe more about a massive restructuring, a reorientation.
That seems to be the gist for many interpretations. Not necessarily destruction in the classic apocalyptic sense, but a powerful shift, a turning point leading towards a new era, a new way of being.
Okay, so beyond the stars and planets, what about more direct, faith-based prophecies? Are specific religious figures talking about 2025?
Yes, our sources do include insights from contemporary faith leaders. Someone like Didio, for instance. He has a vision that's quite different from, cataclysm. He believes God is actively positioning leaders. He compares them to biblical figures, Joseph and Esther, placing them in government and business and cultural institutions.
Joseph and Esther figures? Interesting analogy. What's the idea there?
The core idea seems to be that these divinely appointed individuals will be empowered to uh, preserve nations and speak truth to power.
Mm-hmm.
So it implies a time not of destruction, but of significant moral, spiritual, and societal influence, steering things towards a more, well, righteous or God-aligned path in his view.
Okay, so I'm getting this right. This is much more focused on influence, spiritual change, societal transformation, rather than a literal fiery end of the world. That feels like a key difference from some of those older, more doom and gloom predictions we talked about.
Exactly. It's a crucial distinction. It suggests an active, guiding hand, maybe, rather than just a predetermined destructive fate. Didio also emphasizes a renewed focus on prayer. He calls it a lifeline for believers, seeing prayer as the spiritual birthplace for a coming revival. So it suggests an internal spiritual shift within the faithful that he believes will then ripple outwards, impacting society.
But it won't be easy.
No, he acknowledges that. He explicitly notes that challenges and perseverance will be needed. He says there will be battles, but that endurance, sticking with it, is key for the church and its mission. It really reads like a call to action, a call for resilience, urging people to actively participate, to endure in shaping the future, rather than just passively waiting for some specific doomsday date. It speaks to a belief in human agency, maybe working alongside divine agency, actively pushing toward a certain kind of future.
Okay, let's pivot pretty sharply now. From prophecies and mystical views to predictions grounded much more in empirical science, in systematic observation. What do scientists actually say about some of these claims we've just discussed? And maybe more importantly, what real-world events, what trends are they tracking that genuinely deserve our focus? This is where we get into the data, right?
Right. And this transition really highlights where that distinction between, let's say, speculation and evidence-based analysis becomes absolutely critical. Science works differently. It's built on testable hypotheses, data you can observe and measure rigorously, findings that others can review and try to reproduce. The whole aim is to systematically understand how the universe and our world work, to predict things based on physical laws and data, not divining destiny or reading signs.
So we just heard about the big astrological significance given to that February 28, 2025 planetary alignment. 7 planets all bunched up. What do astronomers, looking at the exact same thing with telescopes and physics models, make of it? Is there any scientific reason for the dramatic takes?
Well, from the astronomical perspective, yes. Alignments like that are interesting orbital events. They happen. But astronomers are very clear. Configurations like that have no known significant gravitational effects on Earth that could cause disasters. To put it simply, the pull from even nearby planets like Mars or Jupiter, it's tiny, just negligible compared to our moon, which drives tides, or the massive gravity of the sun holding everything together.
So visually interesting maybe, but no earthquakes.
Exactly. Scientifically, they aren't triggers for earthly catastrophes, earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, none of that.
Huh.
This is a really fundamental scientific distinction from the mystical view. The phenomenon is real, the planets align. But the predicted impact? From science? Nope. The laws of physics just don't support those kinds of catastrophic links.
Okay, so planetary alignments might not be causing disasters down here, but climate science. That paints a very different and frankly far more urgent picture. Real risks, real threats unfolding. Let's shift to the Climate Risk Index. This isn't prophecy. This is about measuring past impacts and predicting future trends based on hard data. Right.
Precisely. The Climate Risk Index, the CRI, especially the 2025 edition, isn't a forecast like a doomsday prophecy. It's really a meticulous look backward. It measures the consequences of risks that have already happened, actual impacts from climate-related extreme weather. And it's built on solid data from very reputable sources. The EMDAT International Disaster Database, the World Bank, the IMF. So think of it as a critical accountability tool. It tells us where and how climate change impacts have already hit hardest. It's a stark reality check.
So what are the really key takeaways? What does this hard data tell us about the human cost, the economic toll that these climate disasters have already inflicted globally?
Yeah, the numbers in the CRI are, well, they're stark, pretty sobering. Between 1993 and 2022, that's a 30-year window. Over 765,000 people died worldwide directly because of climate-related extreme weather. And the direct economic losses. Nearly 4.2 trillion US dollars adjusted for inflation. That's from over 9,400 documented extreme weather events.
4.2 trillion, that's immense.
It's staggering. And it shows not just the human tragedy, but the huge financial burden. The countries most affected over that whole 30-year span consistently include places like Dominica, China, Honduras, highlighting regions with these long-term deep vulnerabilities. More recently, just in 2022, Pakistan, Belize, and Italy were hit hardest. That shows it's a shifting target, but the impact is consistently severe, hitting globally. These aren't just numbers on a page. They represent lives lost, homes gone, economies completely disrupted on a massive scale.
What specific kinds of extreme weather are we mostly talking about here? The ones driving these huge figures, and what are their different kinds of impacts?
The CRI points mainly to floods, storms, heat waves, and droughts as the biggest culprits, both short-term and long-term. Looking at 1993 to 2022, storms caused the most economic damage, a huge 56% of the total, about $2.33 trillion. Floods were next at 32%, or $1.33 trillion. Floods were also responsible for affecting half of all people globally impacted by disasters. But alarmingly, heat waves, which often seem less dramatic visually, maybe caused a devastating 30% of all the deaths over the long term. They often kill silently, especially hitting vulnerable people.
30% from heat waves.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And some concrete examples really drive it home. Hurricane Maria in 2017 just flattened Dominica. Massive relative economic losses wiped out years of progress. Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar in 2008, truly catastrophic, killed nearly 140,000 people, mostly in floods, caused billions in damage, crippled the country. And Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu in 2015, the damage was around 60% of the country's entire GDP, affected over two-thirds of the population. Shows how one event could just derail a whole nation.
That's just staggering, the scale of it. So, given these trends, what does climate science tell us about the future? Are we seeing an undeniable increase? Frequency, intensity, maybe even the geographic spread of these events? Is this the new normal people talk about?
Well, the consensus from climate science, based on thousands of researchers worldwide, is pretty clear. It clearly shows that climate change increases the risk for both categories of affected countries. That means places historically hit by unusual extremes and places hit by recurring events. Both are seeing increased risk. The science indicates it's transforming uncommonly extreme events into continual threats, creating a new normal. This isn't just theory, it's what's being observed.
New normal.
Yeah. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its big sixth assessment report, they emphasize something crucial and deeply unfair. The most vulnerable people and systems are observed to be disproportionately affected, meaning the world's poorest, most marginalized communities, the ones who've contributed the least to the greenhouse gas emissions causing this mess, they're bearing the brunt.
That's a critical point.
Absolutely. And the scale of heatwave deaths in Europe back in 2022 is a grim reminder, too. Over 18,000 estimated deaths in Italy, 3,000 in Greece, a shocking 11,000 in Spain. Temperatures hitting crazy highs like 43.2 Celsius. It shows even developed nations aren't immune, but the impact still hits hardest on those with fewer resources to cope and adapt.
So can scientists actually link these specific extreme events directly to human-caused or anthropogenic climate change? This is where that attribution science comes in, right? Moving beyond just correlation to actual causation.
Exactly. Attribution science is the field that tries to do just that, and it's getting more sophisticated all the time. It's complex, but the basic idea is to quantify the human influence on specific weather events. They use advanced climate models, statistical analysis, compare the likelihood and intensity of an extreme event happening in our current climate with human-caused warming versus how likely would have been in a hypothetical world without that warming.
Okay, so they run simulations.
Kind of, yeah. Comparing worlds. For example, studies using this method found that the flood levels during Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 were estimated to be 15 to 60% higher in coastal areas, specifically because of human-induced sea level rise, which is a direct result of global warming. So it's not just rising waters, it's making devastating storms even more destructive.
That makes sense.
And findings pulled together in the latest IPCC report indicate that a big rainfall event, the kind you'd historically expect maybe once in 10 years, now has a 1.3 times chance of occurring every 10 years and will bring greater precipitation globally. And the report warns that frequency is just expected to increase as warming continues. So these aren't just random incidents. They're becoming more common, more intense, and more clearly linked to our changing climate.
Sounds incredibly complex, though. Are there big challenges in doing this attribution, like getting the right data, especially from different parts of the world?
Oh yes, substantial challenges. Data availability and quality are huge issues. There are significant data gaps, particularly for countries in the global south, which unfortunately can lead to them being misrepresented in analyses like the CRI. Heat waves, for instance. Despite being lethal, they're notoriously underrecorded in sub-Saharan Africa, even though the region experiences frequent and severe ones. The EMDAT disaster database, for example, reports basically no significant heat wave impacts there since 1900. That's almost certainly a data problem, not reality.
Which hinders policy, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Lack of data hinders effective policymaking, resource allocation,
Yeah.
and on top of that, you have other human interventions besides climate change. Think about extensive dam building, changes in how rivers and coasts are managed, land use changes like deforestation or agriculture. These all profoundly influence flood dynamics too. These local factors can amplify climate effects, sometimes mitigate them, sometimes even outweigh them. It adds layers of complexity to analyzing floods and makes attribution a really multifaceted job.
So what's being done globally? Are international efforts actually keeping pace with these increasingly dire scientific risk predictions? Or is there a big gap between knowing the threats and the global response?
Well, the Climate Risk Index context paints a pretty stark picture of a severe gap, actually. Around 3.3 to 3.6 billion people, that's nearly half the world's population, already live in conditions highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. Yet there's this alarming adaptation finance gap. The estimated need to help these communities adapt is somewhere between 215 and 387 billion US dollars every year. But in 2022, only 28 billion was actually provided.
20 billion versus needs in the hundreds of billions. That's a huge shortfall.
Massive. And what's worse, most of that funding comes as loans, not grants, which just puts more strain on highly indebted developing countries who are already struggling to pay existing debts. The public money allocated for adaptation right now falls way short of the internationally agreed target, which is 50% for a balance between mitigation cutting emissions and adaptation adjusting to impacts. In 2022, only 32% went to adaptation, and only 28% of all climate finance was given as grants. It's especially tough for global South countries, makes it harder for them to build resilience.
Sounds like the whole system is really struggling to adapt financially, implementation-wise. What about broader efforts, like the UN's Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction? Any progress there or similar issues?
The Sendai Framework, which runs from 2015 to 2030, it's seen uneven progress globally. There have been some important gains, definitely. Global disaster mortality, for instance, is nearly half per 100,000 people. That's significant. And early warning systems have improved a lot in many places. But the overall picture is still challenging. Worryingly, two-thirds more people were affected by disaster impacts, even with low mortality.
More people affected. How does that work?
It suggests maybe we're better at saving lives immediately, but the scale or frequency of events is increasing, impacting more livelihoods, homes, infrastructure. And crucially, economic loss owing to disasters is still high and expected to further increase. Huge burden on economies. And even though more countries now have national strategies for disaster risk reduction on paper, the international support for vulnerable global South countries is still largely insufficient. This really holds back their progress in critical areas: data capacity, strong governance, comprehensive risk management. Even developed countries struggle. The severe floods in Germany in 2021 tragically killed over 180 people. That highlighted systemic failures in risk management there. Warnings weren't issued effectively, or people didn't know how to react.
Are there any bright spots, any success stories maybe from those most vulnerable countries where innovative approaches have actually reduced risks and saved lives?
Oh, absolutely. Bangladesh is often cited as a truly remarkable example. Through decades of focused effort, better risk prevention, adaptation strategies, this incredibly vulnerable nation achieved a huge drop in cyclone deaths. They went from a horrific 500,000 fatalities in one cyclone back in 1970 down to just over 4,200 in 2007.
That's an incredible reduction. How?
Investments in early warning systems, building cyclone shelters, community-based preparedness programs, even mangrove reforestation to buffer storm surges. It shows that sustained, effective measures really can save countless lives. However, our sources also point out a big implementation gap when it comes to national adaptation plans, or NAPs. These are the formal plans countries submit outlining how they'll adapt. As of late 2024, only 62 countries had actually formulated and submitted an NAP. And here's the kicker. Apart from Pakistan, which only submitted theirs after being devastated by floods in mid-2023, none of the 10 countries hit hardest in 2022 had submitted one. And of the 10 hit hardest over the whole 30 years, only the Philippines had submitted one, and that was just in 2024.
So the planning is happening slowly, but not necessarily where it's needed most urgently.
Exactly. It highlights this dangerous gap between planning intentions and actual on-the-ground implementation in the most vulnerable places. A real chasm between talking and doing.
Okay, shifting focus a bit. Beyond climate, Are there other natural things scientists watch closely? Things that have significant, maybe not apocalyptic, but real implications for us? Like, what about our sun?
Indeed. Good example. Our sources include, for instance, a NASA science report from June 17th, 2025. It details an X1.2 solar flare captured by their Solar Dynamics Observatory. Now, this isn't a doomsday event, absolutely not linked to any mystical prophecies, but it is something scientists track constantly with huge precision. Why? Because it has very real, though usually manageable, impacts on Earth and especially our technology. It's a perfect example of proactive scientific monitoring to understand and mitigate natural risks.
Okay, so what is a solar flare exactly, and why track them so closely? How do these bursts from the sun actually affect us down here?
Right, so solar flares are basically powerful bursts of energy erupting from the sun's surface. They usually come from sunspots areas with intense magnetic activity. They're classified by intensity. X-class flares are the most intense, and the number after it gives more detail. So an X1.2 is a pretty significant flare. These flares, and often the related CMEs, coronal mass ejections, which are huge blasts of plasma and magnetic field, can shoot high-energy particles towards Earth.
High energy particles
Hmm.
sounds potentially bad.
Well, again, definitely not world-ending. But they can have tangible impacts. They can impact radio communications, causing shortwave radio blackouts that affects planes, ships. They can disrupt electric power grids by inducing extra currents in long power lines, potentially triggering blackouts if the grid is vulnerable. They interfere with navigation signals like GPS, making them less accurate for a time. And they definitely pose risks to spacecraft and astronauts. Increased radiation exposure, potential damage to sensitive electronics up there. So it's a prime example of science actively monitoring real-world disruptions from nature, developing things like space weather forecasts to predict and mitigate the effects. All without blaming mystical causes or signaling the apocalypse. It's just practical risk management in our solar system.
Okay, let's switch gears completely now. Let's look at technology. What kind of predictions are scientists, engineers, tech folks making for 2025? It feels like artificial intelligence, AI, is just everywhere in these conversations. Lots of talk about really rapid, maybe disruptive advances.
Yeah, it really dominates the tech prediction landscape. Our sources, especially looking at discussions in online communities like Reddit's A Singularity, show that predictions for 2025 are heavily focused on truly groundbreaking AI advancements, particularly around emergent capabilities and real-world uses. There's a strong expectation in these communities for AI showing emergent research capabilities.
Emergent research capabilities. What does that mean practically?
It means AI systems could potentially start autonomously discovering new scientific knowledge, maybe formulating hypotheses, even designing experiments, pushing boundaries in ways that used to be solely human-led innovation. There's a lot of speculation that models like GPT-5, for example, could potentially hit scores like 90% on math and 98% on MMLU benchmarks.
Okay, explain those benchmarks. Why are they significant?
Sure. Math tests high-level mathematical reasoning problem solving. MMLU, massive multitask language. Understanding tests broad general knowledge, common sense reasoning across like 57 different subjects. Getting scores that high would signal a massive leap towards more human-like cognitive abilities in AI, way beyond just memorizing or spotting patterns, and potentially having advanced long-term memory, allowing for much more coherent, context-aware conversations that remember past interactions.
So not just raw power, but a jump in reasoning, problem solving, memory. That feels like a big shift in how we'd interact with AI.
Exactly. The expectations are for a really substantial jump in AI's cognitive abilities and practical usefulness. Beyond the technical scores, people are anticipating more lifelike AI friends. That points towards the social, maybe even emotional integration of AI into daily life. Not just chatbots, but AI companionship may be evolving to feel genuinely human-like, possibly filling social needs for some people.
AI friends.
Yeah. And there's also talk about a projected release of a model called O2 by year end. It's expected to shatter the current benchmarks and probably be one of the first AIs capable of autonomous research. That implies a potential paradigm shift in how R&D gets done, maybe accelerating science at an unprecedented speed. Some go even further, predicting that AGI, artificial general intelligence, AI that can do any intellectual task a human can, might be teased or released to the public sometime between late 2025 and mid-2026. That would be truly transformative and for many, pretty alarming, redefining intelligence, labor, everything.
That paints a picture of incredibly fast change, immense AI potential. But with such huge advancements seemingly on the horizon, what are the concerns, especially for us humans, for society, individual well-being? What are the potential downsides people are worried about with this accelerating tech?
Absolutely. The conversations in these online groups and broader critiques, too, definitely highlight significant concerns. Worries about what could be a very difficult transition period for society. A key fear is that rates of depression increase dramatically. Why? Primarily linked to technology evolving so fast that human skills just become obsolete quicker than ever before. This concern is noted particularly for software engineers, ironically, but it really extends to many jobs, people finding their specialized knowledge suddenly devalued or even replaced entirely.
So it's the pace of obsolescence.
Yeah, the pace. The feeling is, while AI might empower some, make jobs easier, enable new creation, it could simultaneously be a trigger for many depressed people struggling to adapt to such huge societal and economic shifts. It's not just about losing jobs, maybe, but a fundamental questioning of human value and purpose in a world increasingly run by intelligent machines. This echoes that common critique of unchecked techno-optimism you hear from philosophers, social critics, that tech progress, while seeming great on one level, can have deep, unforeseen negative consequences on mental health, social cohesion, economic structures, if we don't manage it carefully, proactively. The speed of change itself can be a massive source of anxiety.
This whole deep dive, it's really revealed this striking contrast, hasn't it, between our enduring fascination with dramatic apocalyptic myths, these prophecies, and then the growing urgency of scientifically predicted, data-driven threats like climate change or this rapid, disruptive AI advancement. But stepping back, why are we as a species so compelled to predict the future, even when, historically, our predictions are often wrong or when they just generate huge anxiety? What's this fundamental human drive about?
That's really where the philosophical, the psychological side of things comes in, helping us understand our deep, often quite paradoxical relationship with uncertainty. It's not just what we predict, but the deeper reasons why we feel this need to predict at all. It taps into our fundamental search for meaning, for control, in a world that often feels, well, chaotic.
Our sources describe it as this profound, almost instinctual human impulse to know what's coming. It's driven us forever, right?
Yeah.
From peering at animal entrails, charting stars, consulting oracles, all the way to our modern climate models, economic forecasts, complex simulations. What does this relentless quest for foresight reveal about us?
Well, this instinct is described as neither naively optimistic nor morbidly fixated. It is a testament to our capacity for reflection and responsibility. It comes from wanting to plan, prepare, protect ourselves, our communities. But our sources highlight this profound paradox. In an age where many perceive we're on the brink of collapse, or at least facing unprecedented challenges, this very instinct becomes a double-edged sword. The more data we get about tomorrow, modeling climate futures, simulating AI, impacts, the less, it seems, we trust that tomorrow as we know it will even exist. We've kind of gone from, I don't know, etching hopes on cave walls to maybe doom scrolling through simulations of societal collapse. Knowledge, once seen as empowering, has maybe become an unbearable burden for some, leading to paralysis, not action.
That's a really profound idea. Too much foresight being paralyzing. What does it mean to be trapped in this slow cancellation of the future, as the philosopher Franco Berardi puts it? How does that feel? What does it imply for how we live?
Right, Girardi and others suggest we've entered this phase where we live as if the apocalypse is already a done deal, not some potential future, but an unfolding present. In that mindset, foresight doesn't empower, it strangles. Instead of helping us shape the future, it just burdens us with the perceived inevitability of collapse, leads to exhaustion, resignation. Time itself, in this view, feels terminal, like we're watching a patient on life support, implicitly asked to pull the plug with every unsustainable choice we make or every systemic problem we fail to fix.
Wow, terminal time.
Yeah. And this shifts the big human question, doesn't it? From what will happen, which implies a future we can still influence, to something more immediate, more existentially challenging. What will we become and how will we act in the face of what is happening? It refocuses us from predicting an outcome to engaging with a present that feels increasingly precarious, maybe predetermined. It's a call to rethink agency when things feel hopeless.
So, if the future feels terminal, if we're facing this deep existential dread, this sense of powerlessness, how do we find meaning? How do we find purpose? Is there a way to live ethically, meaningfully, when faced with what feels like inevitable decline?
Well, drawing on long traditions of existential thought, ethical philosophy, someone like Guy McPherson, for instance, argues for a radical kind of ethical living. His point is basically, we should embrace honesty, compassion, community, live with deep integrity despite what he sees as impending doom. He argues even if, say, near-term human extinction were certain, the real challenge is to inhabit the present ethically, to weave new stories of resilience, interdependence, and humble co-creation. It's about radically shifting focus from preventing an inevitable future, maybe, to profoundly investing in how we live right now, in our relationships with each other, with the planet.
Finding meaning in the present actions.
Exactly. It's a powerful call to find intrinsic meaning, purpose in our actions, our relationships, even when those grand narratives of endless progress feel broken. It asks us to define our humanity not by our ability to control destiny, but maybe by our capacity for compassion, for connection, right here, right now, in the face of it all.
Okay, let's switch to psychology now. What does psychology tell us about this deep-seated need for predictions and how we instinctively react to profound uncertainty?
Psychology sees uncertainty not just as, missing information. It's an effective cognitive condition of human experience, meaning it hits us emotionally and intellectually. It generates what's called a crisis of meaning, because it fundamentally challenges our ability to make sense of the world, to build coherent stories, find our place. That traditional idea of a perfectly clear, rational mind always operating logically, that gets challenged here. We aren't always fully in control or even aware of our motivations. Pure rationality isn't the only way humans know or behave, especially facing the unknown.
Right.
And when we face deep, pervasive uncertainty, especially what some call the antinomical structure of the world, this world full of contradictions, where things we want, like construction, growth, are often followed by things we don't, like destruction, decay, humans hit what philosophers call limit situations. These are moments where our usual ways of thinking, our problem-solving frameworks, our comforting stories just break down. They reveal our finiteness and the antinomical nature of existence, highlighting paradoxes that inevitably create profound uncertainty. The anthropologist Ernesto DiMartino, way back in the 40s and 50s, he saw this profound affinity between the experience of the end of the world in the cultural apocalypse and in the psychopathological apocalypse.
An affinity between cultural and personal breakdown.
Yeah. He suggested both involve a severe crisis of presence, which he defined as our ability, individual or societal, to hold on to memories, maintain coherent experiences, keep a stable sense of reality. Essentially, he argued that the deep psychological experience of a personal crisis can mirror society's fears of the world ending, both stemming from this fundamental inability to make sense of overwhelming chaos or information.
So if we're constantly up against this inherent uncertainty, this potential crisis of meaning, how do we cope as individuals, as societies? What are the psychological tools we use to navigate ambiguity?
Well, a really influential theory here is terror management theory, TMT. It suggests that our cultural worldviews perform the important function of alleviating the anxiety generated by the human awareness of vulnerability and death.
Hmm.
Basically, our shared beliefs, values, norms, collective stories, they act as a vital buffer against the existential terror of knowing we're mortal and the world is unpredictable.
Our worldviews protect us.
In a sense, yes. They give us tools to organize what we perceive, create a sense of order and chaos, instill meaning and purpose. They provide a framework to understand things, feel like we can predict or at least influence outcomes. Similarly, the idea of perceived control, just believing you have some ability to get desired results, avoid unwanted ones, that's strongly linked to better adaptability, mental well-being, healthier lives. So when faced with uncertainty, people actively, often unconsciously, try to maintain this sense of control, often by simplifying complex realities, seeking definitive answers, finding order in chaos, even if that order is self-constructed or based on, incomplete info. This drive for control is fundamental.
That links right back to cognitive dissonance, doesn't it? We talked about prophecies failing, yet believers doubling down. When a prediction fails, especially one tied to a core belief or that sense of control, how do people psychologically square that circle, that clash between belief and reality?
Yes, it's a perfect example of cognitive dissonance, that deep discomfort of holding two conflicting ideas. I believe the world ends Tuesday, and then it's Wednesday, and I'm still here.
Mm.
When high-stakes predictions fail, individuals and groups engage in all sorts of psychological maneuvers to reduce that dissonance. They might reconstruct their understanding, reinterpret events, seek out new information that somehow confirms their underlying belief, maybe reevaluate the prophecy's timing or terms. Maybe it meant spiritually, not literally.
Finding ways to make it fit.
Exactly. And this is where narratives become incredibly powerful tools. Our sources stress that this whole sense-making process is inherently narrative, cultural, and intersubjective. Abstract ideas, complex science, big social changes, unsettling uncertainties, they get transformed into concrete, accessible, and to a certain extent, coherent forms. Through stories, narratives, and even those that once known as urban legends have now become known as fake news. These narratives, whether accurate or not, they make the unfamiliar feel familiar, provide a coherent, if not always right, explanation. And crucially, they foster social connection, shared understanding within a group. They meet a deep human need for coherence.
How does this uncertainty, especially the kind that triggers that crisis of meaning, affect groups differently? Do groups react in specific ways when facing insecurity or perceived threats?
Yeah, when groups face pervasive insecurity and existential threat like climate change, economic collapse, or even just the sheer disappointment of a failed prophecy, our sources point to specific, unconscious, often irrational, emotional states emerging that shape collective behavior. One common state is dependency. Individuals feel helpless, maybe unconsciously look to an idealized leader like divinity to protect them, guarantee survival. They project their need for control onto a figurehead or higher power,
Looking for a safe.
essentially. Another state is fight-flight. The group organizes, often defensively, to either actively fight a perceived enemy real or imagined, or to flee the threat altogether. Can manifest as aggression towards outsiders or a desperate attempt to withdraw, isolate. And the third one, maybe the most intriguing, is hope, characterized by this widespread and shared feeling of confident expectation of some saving event or intervention that will fix everything. But notably, for this specific kind of group-binding hope to sustain itself, that saving event must never happen. Its perpetual anticipation, the never-ending promise, becomes the very thing holding the group and its beliefs together, maintaining this state of continuous, unfulfilled expectation. These are deep, primal, often unconscious collective reactions to overwhelming uncertainty.
That's a lot about how we try to impose order, find cause and effect, even when it might not be there, just to cope. But what about those moments, those weird coincidences that seem to defy simple causal links, yet feel profoundly meaningful to us personally?
That brings us right to Jungian synchronicity, that fascinating concept. It refers to significant coincidences, the simultaneous occurrence of an internal psychic event like a vivid dream, a sudden insight, a strong gut feeling happening at the same time as an external objective event that seems meaningfully related, but importantly, with no direct causal link between the two. This principle suggests the existence of non-causal links, implying an inherent unpredictability, uncontrollability, in certain events that can't just be boiled down to simple cause and effect.
Non-causal links.
Yeah. Wolfgang Pauli, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who is deeply influenced by Jung, he suggested that reality itself is just too complex to be described in an exhaustive manner by the principle of causality alone. End quote. He argued this complexity makes synchronicity necessary, as another complementary way to understand the world, acknowledging patterns, meaningful connections that operate outside standard linear causality. It offers another lens, doesn't it, for humans trying to make sense of a world that isn't always strictly linear or predictable, finding meaning in patterns that aren't necessarily causal, but still feel deeply significant to our own experience. So where does all this leave us then? As we stand here looking towards 2025 or whatever comes next, we've journeyed through this persistent, almost innate human drive to foresee the future. We've explored it through the lens of ancient prophecy, astrological shifts, and through the rigorous data, the precise models of modern science. This drive, as we've seen, it seems to stem from this fundamental human need to make sense of existence, navigate uncertainty, maybe exert some form of control over what lies ahead.
Yeah, we've explored how 2025, just like countless years before it, becomes this kind of focal point for all these diverse predictions, these anxieties, from that idea of Joseph's and Esther's rising to influence society to that visually stunning planetary alignment interpreted as a sign of profound change. And of course, the very real scientifically tracked climate risks and these rapidly advancing, potentially transformative AI technologies. Each perspective, mystical or scientific, is trying to map out the future, isn't it? But with vastly different methods and crucially vastly different implications for how we perceive, how we react to what's coming.
Exactly. And critically, we've dug into the deep psychological roots of this universal human urge to predict. We've looked at how we inherently construct meaning, how we desperately try to cope with uncertainty, how we even find comfort in compelling stories, regardless of their strict scientific grounding. That striking contrast between the repeated historical failures of apocalyptic myths and the growing, often unsettling certainty of scientifically predicted environmental shifts or rapid tech changes, it really highlights a fundamental human tension. Our deep desire for clear, definitive answers versus the complex, messy, inherently uncertain reality of an unfolding future.
This deep dive has really shown us, I think, that our enduring fascination with the future isn't just about what will happen to us. Perhaps even more profoundly, it's about who we become and how we choose to act in the face of what is happening right now. So, as you listening reflect on these very different ways of looking ahead, the prophecies, the data, the psychological undercurrents we've discussed, what stands out to you? How does this deep dive shape your own understanding of agency, of responsibility in this present moment, as we all navigate the complexities of whatever lies ahead?